Okay. Can everybody hear that? Test, test. All right. Everybody up in the balcony okay? All right. There we go. Okay, tonight we're going to be talking about a guy by the name of Jephthah. And he's a pretty interesting character. But he's, if you all remember way back to last week, Harry's Bible study, he is going to be the answer to the question that the Israelites were asking. Judges 10:18 tells us, the leaders of the people of Gilead said to each other, whoever will take the lead in attacking the Ammonites will be head over all who live in Gilead. So that's kind of where we're going to start out at tonight. And we'll start here with verse 1 and get right into it. Now Jephthah, the Gileadite, was a mighty warrior, but he was the son of a prostitute. Gilead was the father of Jephthah, and Gilead's wife also bore him sons. And when his wife's sons grew up, they drove Jephthah out and said to him, you shall have no inheritance in our father's house, for you are the son of another woman. So when I read this, I started thinking, go ahead. I'm sorry, what? Oh, we're in Judges chapter 11, verse 1. All right, I was assuming you didn't want the address of the church, so that's why. Okay. All right, we'll go from there. But anyways, when I read that, and I said he was a mighty warrior, but he was the son of a prostitute. And I thought, okay, that's significant, but why would that negate everything else about him as far as being a mighty warrior? And why, out of everything that they could have said about him, why did they start there? And then I started thinking about the family structure. And this kind of gets a little bit off track, but I think it's important because it tells us who these people are, how their culture works, and it gives us a context of what's going on here and why it's so important. And it kind of helps paint the picture of Jephthah. And, first I wanted to start out with just the simple things that we know about. And we hear these words in the Bible, but we don't often associate them. We kind of use our imagination to fill in the blanks of what they are. But we hear a lot about a tribe and a clan and all that stuff. And real quickly, I just want to say that, like now, this all starts out with a family. There's the family, a father, a mother, and the children. And then after that, you'll have the clan. And the clan is going to be a smaller group, and they're united by their ancestry. And they're usually descendants of the common ancestor, and they emphasize the lineage and the family connection. And this would include extended family, like aunts, uncles, cousins. That would be their clan. And I think that's pretty easy to understand, and we still kind of go use that today. And then, of course, the tribe would be a group of these clans that get together. They have a common language, a common culture. They live in the same territory. They make up the clan. They often have their own political organization and leadership separate from the other tribes. And then we all heard about the 12 tribes of Israel. They make up a nation, the nation of the Israelite people. And so as we go through this chapter, these terms will come up. So I just wanted everybody to be able to mentally visualize what the difference is when you're talking about a clan versus a tribe versus the family, and how these play a role together in making people who they are. So Jephthah is identified as the firstborn of his father Gilead, and he's branded the son of a prostitute. But Gilead had other sons by his legitimate wife. And that kind of brought me to the question that I had, that hopefully some of you would have too, is why is this so important? Because as we read our Bible, we hear about all these people who have, a wife, and then they have another wife, and then they have a concubine, And then they have servant girls and slaves and all that stuff. And so what is the difference? Structurally, why is this important, and how important is it? And how do they all work together? And how does it work socially for these people in their tribes and in their clans? So I just wanted to spend a few minutes to break it down. And first we have to understand that God's design for marriage in Genesis has never changed. Okay, God's design stays the same. But even today, there's confusion surrounding the issue of marriage, what it means, how do you define it, who's involved, and all that stuff. So it's not that we become so advanced and those people were so primitive that they couldn't understand what marriage was and how God intended it to work. It's just how it is with our fallen sin nature. We struggle with sometimes the simplest things. God's design for marriage shows us the wisdom of God and the foolishness of man. God did not condone man's plans for marriage, all the other things that he added, but it had to be addressed. And that's why it is addressed in the Bible, some of the other things that we're talking about here with the concubines and all that other stuff. Genesis 2:24 says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And that seems pretty easy to understand. It seems like there shouldn't be a lot of problems with people understanding what God intended for marriage and how it's supposed to work in our cultures and in our societies. And even if we bring other cultures into our culture, they should assimilate into that kind of a belief in our culture. We should hold that firmly and strong. For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. And that's from 1 Corinthians 14:33. So then you have to say, well, where did all this confusion come from? Why did all this confusion happen in the family and the family structure? From the family right on up to the tribe. Where did all this come from? And why is it so important? Well, it came from the pagans and their beliefs. These pagans were invited into the Israelite tribes by the Israelites themselves. They brought with them, the people that were invited, brought with them their beliefs, customs, false gods into the Israelite culture. And what I mean by invited is back in those days, you've probably read Bible stories where they would go out and they would conquer these other nations and these other tribes. And as part of the booty from that battle, they would bring back some of the people that weren't killed, and they would then put them into their culture as servants and slaves and that kind of thing. And with them, they would bring back these different gods and customs and things that were not part of the Israelite worship. They had their own ideas, their own gods, and all that kind of stuff. And God specifically told the Israelites not to do that. He said, don't bring these people back into your tribes because it's gonna mess things up. They're gonna bring with them things that you should not have in your culture. And what did the Israelites do? They did it. And why do we see so many problems in Judges? Because then they fall away from God. They start getting involved in all these random different beliefs that the pagans bring in. And then pretty soon they're displeasing God. They're spending more time worshiping the pagans' religious beliefs and their customs and ceremonies than they are what our God wanted them to do. And that's called syncretism. Did I say that right, Ken? Where's Ken? Did I say that right? All right. And that's mixing pagan religious practices with their worship of our God, God and Yahweh. So there was a practice then that we're not going to get rid of it. We're going to keep what we like and what we think is good, and we're going to mix it in with our religion. And of course, in Deuteronomy 5, 6, and 7, God says, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. Again, that's pretty clear. I don't want us to have any other gods before these pagan gods and stuff. And again, we think, well, that was then. Those people were primitive. And now we don't have those problems. But there are a lot of pagan customs and stuff in our everyday lives that we don't even recognize. We bring that stuff in. And some of them, to name a few popular ones, of course, is Halloween and Easter, and some of the things we do, even the days of the week and the months, those are all pagan gods and things. It happens so gradually, and it feels so benign that you don't even realize it's happening, that this stuff is coming into your culture. And it does. And, that a lot of times people say, how can we serve a God, or how can you serve a God that appears to be so exclusive of so many people? And he's not trying to be exclusive of the people. He's trying to be exclusive of the pagan gods and all the things that they will bring into your culture, because that ultimately will destroy them. Next thing, you're bringing in these pagan rituals and ideas, and then they're burning their babies on an altar. And I know that sounds terrible, but it happened. It happened, and the Israelites participated in that. And so, for those who think that they could be God, and they say, well, if I was God, I would do it this way, or I would do it that way, because they can't imagine excluding people. Well, I say to them, don't try to be God, because you don't have the wisdom of God or the knowledge of God, and he sees what this will do to the cultures and what it will bring into the cultures. And that's why he's telling people, stay away from that stuff. So anyways, it just turned into a mess with this stuff, and I'm getting to the point where how this mess ends up going into our relationships. A man would take a wife, and the wife we took was his primary wife. The marriage was sealed with a contract and payment of a dowry. It was called a mohar, or a bride's price, and she would run the household. The marriage contract protected her should her husband die. And don't forget, back then, just like now, people died. But there wasn't protection for some of these women. And if they didn't have this contract and didn't have this protection, they would have been out on the streets. And not only them, but their children also. And so they wanted these things for protection for them, should their husband die or any other thing. And it also helped keep the family inheritance in the original clan, which was an important thing to them. Now, an Israelite husband could take a second wife, but it's just not like, every guy couldn't just go and grab another woman and say, okay, you're going to be my wife now. It didn't work that way. There was social parameters to this stuff. Now, if the first marriage, if the woman could not bear children, that was one reason why a guy could have another wife. But if he took another wife, he couldn't deny the first wife of her basic needs, her food, clothing, shelter, things like that. So yes, men could have another wife, but only if they could still provide for the first one. And they would also do that because it would increase their social status in the community and within the tribe, and ultimately, within even the nation. These people were seen as a little bit higher class if you were able to support several wives and all that stuff. So that's why some people did it. And if anybody has any questions or wants to put any input, because like I said, I don't necessarily teach what I already know. I teach what I learn. And a lot of this stuff I have learned, and I'm passing it on to you because I think it's valuable in establishing who Jephthah was and why he was treated the way he was. Okay, now the primary wife, she had complete authority over the household. And also another way a guy could have a wife, and I think I should throw this in before I forget it, but if his brother died, he was then responsible to marry his brother's wife. And it even went farther than that. If his brother had no children at the time of his death, then the firstborn of that new relationship was considered the brother's heir, which to us probably wouldn't make no sense because there's no blood connection there really, other than, the wife. But so that part I thought, oh, all right. But again, this is not God's design. This is man's design to protect what he's trying to protect in a marriage and the people involved. Go ahead. I don't think God set up, I'm not going to disagree with you, Harry, because, but what I'm saying, when God's design is in Genesis, okay? That was God's design. This was not God's design. God did not say, or, if he didn't design divorce, he didn't design concubines, he didn't design a second wife. That's what I mean by this is not God's design.
But he did design that if your brother's wife dies, you take her and what?
Her husband died.
Yeah, her husband dies in the clan, you still take her, and she still has offspring with that name, because so that the inheritance would still go.
Right. Now, again, I agree with what he said. It was God's design, but God was designing that to address the issues that were happening. In other words, that were naturally occurring. But I don't think that was his original design and idea, but that's what he did say in Deuteronomy when they came up with all the rules. That was Moses. He came up with all the rules for marriages. That's when that came about. But it wasn't because that's what God originally intended. That's what came about because of the situation that man had got himself into. Can we agree on that a little bit, or? Okay, all right. And like I said, throw it out there. And of course, the contract legally, they had protection against mistreatment and neglect, and the primary wife's children were seen as legitimate heirs and had strong claim to inheritance over even a second wife. Okay? And they lived in an agrarian society, so obviously the more children you have, an agrarian, there was farmers, and they needed a lot of children, so sometimes, that was a reason to have many kids. Bring on another wife. If you need to have several boys between the age of 13 and 17 to work out in the fields, obviously one woman's not going to be able to give you that. So they would have, several wives that could maybe give them those children they needed to provide the work that had to be done so they could survive as a family and a clan. And then, of course, there was the design for divorce, that if a man marries a woman, but she becomes displeasing to him because he finds some indecency in her, he may write her a certificate of divorce, hand it to her, and send her away from his house. And the only reason I bring that up is because it shows the delicate balance that was there in these families. And again, it might vary a little from culture to culture and clan to clan and tribe to tribe, but basically this was it. And you can see that these women were always living a very desperate kind of life. Go ahead, Harry.
I was stationed in Turkey in 1969, and in their culture, the man only had to say 3 times, "I divorce you." It was always over their head. He could say it twice, and she knew. If he says it again, she's divorced and thrown out.
Wow.
That was in 1969.
Again, not God's plan. Man's plan, not God's plan. God's plan has been the same since Genesis. Okay, then we move from the first wife and the second wife into concubines. And, of course, God did not approve or introduce concubines as a marital model. Concubines were legally recognized by the culture, and they were not considered prostitutes or harlots. They did have some legitimate legal standing. A concubine in ancient Israel was a woman who had marital relationships with a man, but held status inferior of that of a wife. So generally where concubines came into the picture was the family would have servants, slaves and servants. And the wife, not the husband, the wife, if she could not bear children, the wife would go to one of her servants and raise her up. So being a concubine was actually, in that culture and status, a promotion from a slave or a servant to a concubine. And then her job was basically solely to bear children. And that was it. She was just there to have children. And she did not have the legal protection of a wife or even a second wife. She didn't have that. When they were done, they could have cast her out at any time. And there's tragic story in Judges, I think it's 19, and when we get there, you're going to hear the tragic story of a concubine and just how terrible their life could be as a concubine. But it was better than starving in the streets and not having anywhere to go or anybody to care for you. So that's how the culture was at this time. And if you were a woman and you couldn't work and you had to rely on a family to take you in and provide for you, and you'd become a concubine, and you were under the authority of the wife. So if the wife got angry at you, or see, a lot of times what could happen is a concubine becomes pregnant, the wife couldn't bear children, so the concubine might get a little uppity, and the wife would have to put her in her place. And sometimes that included being cast out. Go ahead.
Did that count Hagar? Is she considered a concubine?
Yes.
Yeah, those are both good examples. Both good examples.
Who does she have?
They had Sarah, and Abraham and Sarah, yeah. So, let's see here. They were legally recognized by the culture, so they weren't necessarily, it wasn't like a prostitute or something where they were looked down upon, or a servant or a slave. They actually had some sort of role in the culture and society. They weren't necessarily looked down on, but they definitely did not have the rights or the status of a wife. And generally, they were just brought out of poverty, and then they were just, again, used for childbearing mostly. Now, then we come to servant girls and slave girls. What's the difference between a servant girl and a slave girl? Well, a servant girl held a lower status, but she had lower status, but she wasn't considered property of the male who operated the house. She had her own identity. And also, a servant girl would become a servant girl maybe to get out of debt, or for us it would be like, hey, I need a job. So there's no place for her to work, so she would come to these families and say, hey, I need to eat, I need to be clothed, I need some protection. So you would take in a servant girl, and then of course she was your servant girl. She could be raised up to a concubine, but at this point she was a servant girl. And that would be different than a slave, because a slave were those who were taken captive during an operation, a military operation, and slaves had absolutely no rights. They didn't have any rights, and there was no rights. Even if the master of the house were to have a child by the slave, the child had no rights, the woman had no rights, she was a slave, and it was not a good life. It was not a good life for them. And then even below that, we had the prostitutes, and a prostitute was just something like we even know of today. They were just women within the tribes and that would engage in sexual acts for money. I mean, that hasn't changed over time at all. And they had no legal standing, no protection, and the child would have had the same legal standing as the mother, and that was nothing. So if the father didn't reach down and grab that kid's life would have been horrific. It would have been terrible, if he would even have survived. And then you have the harlots, and that was the lowest end. And a harlot, just a term that refers to a promiscuous woman, and they often, even a prostitute would be referred to as a harlot, but a harlot is actually one step down from a prostitute, and it's the lowest form of a woman that there was in their culture and their society. And of course it carries negative connotations. And so if you were referred to as a harlot in your community, in your tribe, in your clan or whatever, that was the lowest status that a woman could bear. And life for her would have been very bad, very terrible. So that's why we can get back to Jephthah now. And when it talks about that he was a mighty warrior, a good thing, but that he was the son of a prostitute. So based on what we just went over, you can understand the social implications that would bear on him. He was the son of a prostitute. And prostitutes were not at all looked on with any kind of respect at all in their culture. And so, even though he was the firstborn, usually the firstborn have specific rights, and one of the rights that they have is a double portion of the inheritance. So, he would get 50%, and his other brothers would have to share the other half, the other 50%. So, Gilead's wife bore him sons. It doesn't say how many sons. It just said that she bore him sons. So when they grew up, apparently Jephthah's father died because they're arguing over the inheritance. And they drove Jephthah out and said to him, "You shall not have an inheritance in our father's house, for you are the son of another woman," meaning the son of a prostitute. So now you can kind of see where Jephthah would have had a hard time fighting back against that. He would have a hard time arguing for his portion of the inheritance simply because of who his mother was. And that's why it was in that culture such a hard thing to overcome. All right. Let's see. And relationships outside of the marriage were considered illegitimate, so he didn't have any say to any of the inheritance. All right, so let's go on to 3. So it says, "Then Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob. And worthless fellows corrected around Jephthah and went out with him." So let's take a look at Jephthah for a minute now. And he didn't just leave, he was driven out. So then, if you can imagine someone who's living in a family unit with his brothers and his dad and his mom, and his dad apparently raised him up in that family unit. Now his dad is gone, and his brothers basically and his family have turned on him. And so you can understand that when he was driven out, that he would have been angry. He would have been bitter, and that would have stayed with him. Because it's not like he was asked to leave or he chose to leave. He was driven out. And not only that, but can you imagine the disappointment in your own family, the ones that are supposed to care for you, love you, nourish you, support you, have all turned their back on you because your mother was a prostitute, which he had no say in. He couldn't say who his mother was and who his father was. He just knows that he was born and he was brought up in that family. That's all he knows. And then I think the lesson for us today in that is that not necessarily that we still hold that animosity towards people who are children of a prostitute, but we have to be a little bit careful when we start judging others, and we use biblical principles when we do that. Because even in our culture today and in our lives, oftentimes we'll choose things to judge people by or to condemn people for that aren't really biblical. And off the top of my head, well, in today in men's Bible study, they were talking about there were people who were union workers and non-union workers. And the union workers would not talk to the non-union people. They condemn them, cast them out. We don't want anything to do with you. And of course, in our lives today, we also see it in politics, right? There are some things that we should stay away from, but other things that we should understand. We may be judging people with unbiblical principle. We may be treating them like Jephthah was treated here. The Bible doesn't tell us to reject them. They still should be open to hearing the word, and we still should be willing to do that for them. Now, saying that, there are people that can be dangerous to be around, and I think Pastor Frank talked about it a couple weeks ago in his sermon, where there's people you should love from a distance, I think is the term that he used. because, they can be dangerous to your life. Again, like the pagans, they'll bring things into your life that you don't want to have there. So we have to use that discernment that we get from the Holy Spirit when we're dealing with people to know if it's biblical to walk away from them or if it's just something cultural or societal that we really shouldn't be judging people by that. Does everybody kind of get that? Okay. Anybody have any questions on that? Okay. And if you're Jephthah and you were treated that way and you have those feelings and those problems in your life, as a Christian, there's only one way to overcome that. And that is you have to stand back, and identify everybody who's hurt you, everybody who's caused you to have hate and anger and resentment. And you have to look at all those people, and you have to love them and forgive them. And biblically, that's the only way you can get past that. And then you have to ask the next question, how many people are capable of that? That's a pretty hard thing to do because they destroyed his life. As far as he knows, they were destroying his future. They took away his family, everything he loved. And now we're asking him, sit back and love those people who do that and forgive them. But that really is the only way you can beat that. Even today, in our culture and our society today, forgiveness is the only way you're going to overcome that. And that is really hard for us. And I get it. I understand it. I don't know if I could do it. But I know that Jephthah couldn't, at least not then. So it tells us that there in Tob, he proves to be a charismatic figure and a natural leader. So he's a great warrior. No war, no need for a warrior, but he is a charismatic figure and a natural leader. And we got to picture that and realize that that was a gift. That's a gift from God. But then what we're going to see, and like in our own lives, is how do we take that gift from God? Every good and perfect gift is from above. How do we take that and how do we use it in our lives? That's our choice. The gift comes from God, but then we have the free will to use that gift how we choose. And sometimes we don't choose the best way to handle that gift, and I think that's the problem that Jephthah's going to have here too. So today we would probably describe him. Oh, I don't think I ever finished the second part. Did I talk about, and worthless fellows collected around Jephthah, and he went out with them? Did I tell you? Okay. Well, that's the second part of 3. He went to the land of Tob, and worthless fellows collected around Jephthah, and he went out with him. And by going, so you can picture that he was probably with a group that we would describe today as criminals and thugs and troublemakers, and that's who he attached to because that's probably who he found comfort in, people who were kind of like him, shared some of maybe the same experiences and feelings he did, and so that's naturally he might have been drawn to. So they probably went out and they raided towns and other targets to make their living. And the phrase that says went out with him, in that context, it kind of implies like just a band or a party of bandits. And as we experience hardship and suffering in our own lives, we can't completely know or understand what God's purpose may be for such things in our lives. It causes confusion in our lives. Like, why is this happening? Why is God doing this? Even if we're good Christians, we're still going to ask, what am I supposed to get out of this? What am I supposed to learn? And how long is this going to take? Maybe some of us feel like I've been suffering a long time with this, affliction or this problem. Okay, I'll trust that it's here. You want me to learn something from it. But what is that and how long is it going to take? So that's a question that we probably all have, and I'm sure Jephthah did too. So he didn't understand what God was doing at that time, but God was preparing Jephthah. God gave him the heart and soul of a warrior. Unfortunately, it was kind of built on the foundation of anger and bitterness. So we wouldn't have looked at Jephthah and said he was a polished and professional kind of a guy. That's probably not how we'd have looked at him and how we'd have described him. But apparently, he was perfect for what God wanted to use him for. And we have to realize that too. Sometimes we don't recognize what people have that is a benefit to not only to us, but God is using them to, in this case, Jephthah, to save a whole nation. Okay, Judges 4. After a time, the Amorites made war against Israel. And when the Amorites made war against Israel, the elders of Gilead went to bring Jephthah from the land of Tob. That takes some nerve, huh? But yeah. So who are the Ammonites? Since I've been doing Bible study, I've been trying to get a map so that we can sometimes just point to the map and tell where the Ammonites live and where the Gileadites live. But I don't have enough clout, so we don't got a map. So I thought maybe when we got the new building next door, it might come with a map, but it didn't. So I'm still looking for maybe somebody else selling another building. Maybe we can get a map. I'm not sure. But the Ammonites weren't friendly towards the Israelites. They should have been, because they were like distant relatives, distant relatives as far as the clan kind of thing. But they were often counted as enemies. They were cruel people. And one other thing, though, is that they weren't primitive and they weren't weaklings. They were good warriors. And the Israelites understood that. And so did the other tribes around there. They were nothing to take lightly. And the Israelites knew that they were a threat to them. And they had been asking God, that we learned from Harry's Bible study in chapter 10, that they had been basically harassing him for 18 years. And so these people have had to put up with this for 18 years so far. And but that's who the Ammonites were. And they went to make war against Israel. And so the elders said, we have a lot of people. We have an army. We can put together an army. But unfortunately, the Ammonites have a military. So we have a lot of people, but a lot of people without a leader is just a lot of people. And how do you think a lot of people is going to do fighting against a trained military with modern weapons? I mean, probably not real good. So they saw their weakness, and they understood that they were weak in that, and that they needed a leader. So let's just go on to 6 through 8. And they said to Jephthah, "Come and be our leader, that we may fight against the Ammonites." But Jephthah said to the elders of Gilead, "Did you not hate me and drive me out of my father's house? Why have you come to me now when you are in distress?" And the elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, "That is why we have turned to you now, that you may go with us and fight against the Ammonites and be our head over all the inhabitants of Gilead." So, the first question, first of all, they recognize that Jephthah was probably the only one at that time that could provide the leadership that their military needed because of, again, the gifts that God gave him as a leader, and his personality was such that people would follow him. Because to follow someone into battle takes more than just being a nice guy. People have to trust him, and they would have to look at him and say, "Hey, this guy knows what he's doing, he's good at what he does," and we would follow him into battle. So apparently there weren't a lot of people like that at that time in the tribes there that were represented. But, of course, Jephthah asks a couple of pretty good questions. Didn't you guys hate me and drive me out of my father's house? So I'm thinking that possibly his brothers might have been amongst the elders, or maybe were some of the elders. The Bible doesn't tell us, but when he says they drove me out of my house, out of your house, I think his brothers maybe have played a role in that. And another thing that makes me believe that is because they probably knew Jephthah the best and knew his skills, and that he'd probably grown up fighting because of his status in his society. So he was a good fighter. They knew him, and they knew that they should probably turn to him. And then the next question is, why have you come to me now when you're in distress? Well, he probably asked that question because now he's ready to start some negotiation. You know, hey, I got something you need, maybe you got something I want, and they can come together with something. And Jephthah, very probably because of where he lived, way out in Tob, which was like the boonies at that time, he probably knew everything that was going on. He knew that the Ammonites were wanting to attack the Israelites, that they felt now that they were strong enough to take them on. And so he was probably aware of what was going on. And so turning, basically them turning precedes deliverance. In their distress, they turn to the Lord. So I guess I wanted to also point out that even though there's this negotiations going on, that the Lord is controlling all this. And he is going to control the battle, and he is going to control everything that happens as far as Jephthah assuming the role and the battle. All that's already been decided by God. Jephthah answered, this is Judges 11, 9 and 10. Jephthah answered, suppose you take me back to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them to me. Will I really be your head? The elders of Gilead replied, the Lord is our witness. We will certainly do as you say. So here, Jephthah agrees to the deal, but only after the elders place themselves under God's authority and judgment, so that they cannot go back on the word. Okay, and I think does anybody have any questions so far up to this point? I think I can do one more verse here. So Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head of and leader over them. And Jephthah spoke all his words before the Lord at Mizpah. Now Mizpah is where Jephthah, that's where he kind of lived. That's where his house was, or where he resided, but also where the Israelite army was waiting there. And when it says he spoke his word before the Lord, in other words, he got up in front of the people and basically proclaimed that he was doing this, and the elders were directing him. Because don't forget, judges back in those days, and he is going to be their judge for 6 years or whatever it is, 6 years I believe it was. That's not an elected position. That's not, that comes from God. So everybody kind of has to agree that he's going to be their leader. So he spoke to him, and he said some sort of prayer. We don't know what the prayer was. It doesn't say. But he made it clear that God was condoning this or had brought this to him, and that, he was willing to do this. But Jephthah's mind, there's still a question whether the Lord really wants Jephthah to lead Gilead. He has been mentioned, but God's own statements have not been heard. The proof may be in whether the Lord grants victory to Jephthah and Gilead. So Jephthah is kind of wondering, is this really God's will, or are we putting this all together? But based on his personality and his background, he's like, let's do this. If God's on our side, we're going to win. And in my heart, I believe God's on my side. So that's where we're going to leave it for tonight. And next, we're going to start with, next week, we'll talk about how Jephthah starts negotiations with the Ammonites and what he does with that. And it's pretty interesting. So after we have a nice dinner over there, we'll come over here and we'll talk some more about Jephthah and his negotiations with the Ammonites. Anybody have any questions? All right. Go ahead.